The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 5th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The Gospel of the Lord. So every year at Prince of Peace, as Super Bowl Sunday approaches, we make a big push for the Super Bowl, the collection of soup and stew for people who are needy in our community, which we then distribute through Gaithersburg Help. And to get people into this, as many of you know, we always set up the 2 boxes that are there in the narthex, one for the AFC champs and one for the NFC champs, so that people can put their cans into either box and vote for whichever team they want to win. Some years, especially like this year when it's Seattle and New England, where people may not have a very strong vested interest either way, we also have a 3rd box that says something like, who cares? Some years, I don't see that box yet, but some years that's a self-directed pile of stuff where somebody throws a sign that says, who cares? We don't care. But it doesn't matter because everybody ends up having food, and that's the important thing. But even if we don't care who wins, it is always interesting to find out who wins. And it's also interesting to see which team wins in the box, because we have had a long-standing tradition, as many of you know here, that whoever wins the box and gets the most soup is the one that loses the Super Bowl. And so I think this is partly the reason that people strategically place cans in the box of the team they don't want to win, so that they can sort of push that there. But somehow or other, we always seem to have a good predictor of that, because we're always interested in the winner. And that's one of the things that we always have to announce at the end, who won the box thing. That's sometimes more interesting than who won the game. And I've always found it sort of ironic, therefore, because we always are interested in who wins, that as a quirk of this year's lectionary cycle, we always read the Beatitudes as we prepare for Super Bowl Sunday. And it's ironic because, in one sense, the Beatitudes are a series of sayings that talk about how blessed people are when they lose. Blessed are you who are poor in spirit. Blessed are you who mourn. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you. Really, this is not the kind of blessing that I hope for or I look for from God. It's not the kind of blessing I want for others. It's not even the kind of blessing I want to think about. Like many people around Super Bowl Sunday time, I would much rather watch somebody win. Yet, while we often sentimentalize the Beatitudes as pious sayings which promise us pie in the sky for those poor, unfortunate souls who hopefully are not us, the Beatitudes of Jesus are not what they may first appear to many people. I don't know about you, but over the years I have heard people talk about the Beatitudes, and I've often heard some pretty odd and unsatisfying interpretations. Sometimes people read these sayings and they think that there's some kind of deep and profound philosophy that somehow, someday, everything will just be all made right. And there is some truth to that. After all, Jesus does promise that there's a reward that's great in heaven. But that, in and of itself, doesn't make suffering and losing a blessing right now. Indeed, if that's all it is, the Beatitudes ring hollow in the same way as somebody who tells you that your pain is all part of God's plan and not somehow just a bad thing in and of itself. And that is not what Jesus is saying here. Because after all, if suffering was so great, Jesus would not promise relief. And sometimes when people read the Beatitudes and then they explain them, they act as though it's an appeal to some kind of masochism. You know, suffering is good for you, and you are supposed to enjoy it. And maybe if you're not suffering in the right way, it must mean that you're a lousy Christian, because you haven't looked for the kind of suffering that builds character. But you know, I think I'm enough of a character already, and I don't need any more suffering. The suffering that I've got is already plenty. Besides, if the Beatitudes were simply about smiling while you endure suffering, then they aren't really any different than some of the positive thinking stuff that's out there that says just smile and be happy, you're too blessed to be stressed, and all that kind of stuff. And Jesus here is not calling us to live in denial and pretend that all this stuff is wonderful. And there are also these people to read the Beatitudes and they say, well, you know what, this is just basically the proof that Karl Marx was right, that religion is this opiate of the people. And it's true that the Beatitudes have been used over the centuries by people who said that, in fact, what Marx said, you know, this is just the way that the rich tell the poor to suck it up because your reward is great in heaven, so just serve us. But that is not what the Beatitudes are, and that is not what Jesus is saying. So what are these words about? Why did Jesus say them? And more importantly, why did Christians remember them and write them down? It surely was not for any of those reasons. So here's what I think is the key to understanding the Beatitudes. They only make any sense and have any meaning if you read them from the perspective of the resurrection of Jesus. I suspect that these Beatitudes made little sense to most people when they first heard them. But later, when they remembered them from the perspective of the resurrection, the Beatitudes reminded them that God wins in the end, that this really is something that happens in our real actual lives. Jesus actually rises from the dead. And that means that the reward in heaven is not simply a pious wish for someday. It means that God's power to give and restore life really is more powerful than all the stuff that causes the pain, the suffering, the mourning, and the persecution. God really can and really will undo the worst evil the world can dish out, even death. If the Beatitudes were uttered by somebody who simply got chewed up by the system and killed, then they were the fantasy of a crazy person. But if they were uttered by somebody who endured all the suffering he spoke of and then rose from the dead, then there's a real and living hope beyond the suffering. The first Christians experienced the resurrection of Jesus, and they knew that reward in heaven wasn't just a pious hope for someday or a figure of speech. The kingdom of heaven was already becoming a reality in their daily lives right now. And they experienced that reality even, and sometimes especially, in the midst of the suffering they were going through. The other thing about looking at the Beatitudes from the perspective of the resurrection is it means that these Beatitudes were remembered because people saw them as a realization that acting in faithfulness is worth doing, even if it results in pain and suffering, because we're participating in something that lasts and has meaning and purpose. It's one thing to say, well, you're going to act on principle and die trying. It's another to know that the principle will win out, even if you don't make it through. People saw Jesus making God's kingdom a living reality in their daily lives, and that task was not in vain, because in Jesus rising, they knew that God's kingdom was going to continue to happen in their lives and in the life of the world around them, in spite of the pain and the suffering that was going on. And so living into that kingdom right now is worth the investment and the effort, even when it is not appreciated or valued by other people. And the perspective of the resurrection also means that the pain and the brokenness, paradoxically, are not signs of God's absence, but the places where the living Jesus meets us. The resurrection reminded the first Christians that just as Jesus met them alive at the tomb, Jesus had first met them in the midst of disease and isolation and death. When everyone else said their pain was a sign that God had abandoned them, Jesus showed them that their pain was the place where he met them and first made God's presence a living reality in their lives. And because of that, the Beatitudes are about being open to experiencing God's presence, even in the midst of difficult situations when we're going through stuff that we would just rather not go through. And so I think the first Christians remembered the Beatitudes because the Beatitudes reminded them of the reality of the resurrection. And it means they read them, and we should read them also, kind of like this. Blessed are you when you're poor in spirit or mourning right now, because that's where the living Jesus promises to meet you. Blessed are you who hunger and thirst for righteousness today, because it means you're investing yourself in something real that's going to outlast all of the pain and the brokenness. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you, because even if they do those things, you know the power and the presence of Jesus' resurrection. And that means that no matter what, God wins at the end, and that winning is going to include you.